What if 300 men faced an enemy so vast they covered the land like locusts? This is not a legend. It's the true account of Gideon, a timid man chosen by God to lead Israel's smallest army against their greatest threat. A battle where strategy was replaced by faith and weakness became the very weapon that brought victory. Tonight, we journey into one of the most extraordinary battles ever told. A story where fear gripped a nation, enemies swarmed like locusts, and hope seemed all but lost. Yet, in the silence of the night, a single man, unsure, reluctant, and trembling, would rise to lead 300 against thousands. This is not a tale of numbers, but of faith, courage, and the God who turns weakness into victory. The people of Israel found themselves trapped in a cycle of despair. For 7 long years, the Midianites had risen against them, crushing their spirit and stripping away their livelihood. Every time the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, along with their allies, the Amalekites and other eastern peoples, would sweep in like a plague of locusts. They came with their flocks and camels, leaving nothing behind. Fields were emptied, livestock stolen, and families left to starve. Israel was brought to its knees, reduced to hiding in caves and strongholds in the mountains just to survive. The people who once walked in the strength of God were now a nation in hiding, shadows of their former selves. Their land flowed with milk and honey, yet their tables were bare. Their cries of hunger were matched only by their cries of fear. Each day felt like a curse, and the memory of God's promises seemed distant, almost forgotten. But when oppression grows unbearable, the human heart often remembers what pride once forgot. And so Israel cried out, not to kings, not to armies, but to the God of their fathers. Their voices rose from the valleys and mountains, a desperate plea for deliverance. God heard them. He sent a prophet to remind them why this suffering had come. They had turned from him, worshipping the gods of their enemies. Yet, even in their unfaithfulness, God's mercy stirred once again. He was preparing a deliverer, not from the royal courts, not from the mighty warriors of Israel, but from the least expected place, a man who considered himself the weakest of the weak. The story was about to change. Out of the ashes of despair, a flicker of hope was being kindled. Israel's cry had reached the heavens, and heaven was about to answer in a way no one could have imagined. What if the least expected person was chosen to change history? In the hill country of Ophrah, a young man worked quietly in fear. He was not on a battlefield, nor in a place of honor, but crouched near a winepress, threshing wheat in secret. His name was Gideon, and like the rest of Israel, he lived under the heavy hand of the Midianites. Their raids had left his people in hiding, their crops destroyed, and their hope fading. Every strike of Gideon's hand against the grain carried a sense of desperation, as though the simple act of harvesting was an act of rebellion. It was here, in the shadows of fear, that the extraordinary broke into the ordinary. A figure appeared, an angel of the Lord, seated beneath the oak tree that overlooked Gideon's work. The angel's words pierced the silence. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Mighty warrior. Gideon could hardly believe it. He was not a soldier, not a leader, not even from a prominent family. He was the youngest in his father's house, and his clan was the weakest in the tribe of Manasseh. The title sounded almost like mockery to a man who had spent his life hiding from his enemies. With trembling words, Gideon voiced the doubt that had weighed on Israel for years. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about? The angel did not rebuke him. Instead, the command came with quiet authority. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Gideon's heart pounded. Could it really be him? Could God truly choose the smallest, the weakest, the most unlikely? Fear battled faith within him, and yet the presence before him was undeniable. Still, he sought a sign. Preparing an offering of meat and unleavened bread, he set it before the angel. And as the staff touched the food, fire consumed it instantly, vanishing into the smoke of heaven. Gideon fell to his knees, overwhelmed with awe and terror. That day marked a turning point. Gideon, once a timid man in hiding, was called into a destiny he could not yet imagine. The God of Israel had chosen him, not in strength, but in weakness, to prove that deliverance belongs not to the mighty, but to the Lord. Under the scorching sun, the timid farmer, still unsure of what he had just heard, searched for proof. Could it really be God calling him of all people to lead Israel? His heart pounded, torn between disbelief and trembling hope. If this was truly the voice of the Lord, then surely a sign would follow. Gideon hurried into his home, preparing an offering as if for a king. He took a young goat, carefully cooked its meat, and made fresh, unleavened bread from an ephah of flour, more food than a poor man like him could spare. Yet he brought it forth, as if surrendering his doubts with every portion he laid out. Placing the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot, Gideon carried them back to the oak, where the mysterious visitor waited. The man, radiant, yet cloaked in quiet authority, commanded Gideon to place the offering upon a rock. His voice carried no hesitation, no uncertainty. Gideon obeyed, setting the meat and bread on the stone, while the broth spilled across it like a libation. Then came the moment that would shake Gideon's soul forever. The stranger reached out with the staff in his hand and gently touched the food. Instantly, fire erupted, not from flint, not from spark, but from the rock itself. Flames roared upward, devouring the meat, consuming the bread, drinking every drop of the broth until nothing remained but ash. In that single blaze, Gideon's fear met God's confirmation. This was no ordinary man. This was the angel of the Lord, the messenger of heaven himself. And before Gideon could gather his thoughts, before his knees could even hit the ground, the figure vanished into the air, leaving only smoke curling skyward. Terror seized Gideon. His voice shook as he whispered, "Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." He believed he was doomed, for no man could look upon such holiness and live. But into his trembling heart came a gentle assurance. The Lord spoke, "Peace be with you. Do not be afraid. You will not die." And on that sacred ground, Gideon built an altar to the Lord and named it, "The Lord is Peace." Night had fallen over the land, and silence wrapped the village in a tense stillness. In the shadows, Gideon moved quietly, his heart pounding against his chest. The command of the Lord was clear. "Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." This was no small task. To challenge Baal was to challenge the very heart of Israel's corruption, the false worship that had chained his people in fear. By day, Gideon was timid, a man who hid from the Midianites. But that night, he carried within him a spark of courage not his own. He gathered 10 of his servants, each one trembling, each one aware of the danger. Together they walked in silence, their footsteps muffled by the dust of the ground. The altar stood tall, an unholy monument built to honor a powerless idol. Torches flickered in Gideon's hands as he drew near. For a moment, doubt whispered in his mind. What if they see me? What if they rise against me? Yet, stronger still was the voice of God, calling him to obedience. With swift hands, he began to strike. Stones crashed to the earth, wood splintered under his grip. The Asherah pole, towering, carved and worshipped, fell with a thunderous crack that echoed through the night. Gideon's men worked quickly, tearing down what generations had bowed before. And when the dust settled, the altar of Baal was nothing but rubble. But Gideon did not leave the place in ruins. Instead, he built a new altar, one that bore the name of the living God. On it, he laid a bull as a burnt offering, using the very wood of the Asherah pole as fuel for the fire. Flames rose into the night sky, a defiant declaration that Israel's true deliverer was not Baal, but the Lord Almighty. When morning came, the village awoke to outrage. Voices cried, "Who has done this?" The people demanded blood, for Baal had been humiliated. Yet Gideon's father stood and spoke with wisdom. If Baal is truly a god, let him defend himself. And from that day forward, Gideon was called Jerubbaal, meaning, let Baal contend with him. This single act of courage set the stage for Israel's deliverance. The battle against Midian had not yet begun, but already the true war, the war against fear and false gods, was being won. Even after witnessing the fire that consumed his offering, Gideon's heart still trembled with uncertainty. The task before him was overwhelming. To rise against the Midianites, a force that seemed endless, like locusts covering the land. How could one man, the least in his family, from the weakest clan in Manasseh, possibly be the one chosen to deliver Israel? His mind wrestled between faith and fear, between God's call and his own insecurity. In this inner conflict, Gideon sought one more assurance from the Lord. He prepared a simple test, not out of arrogance, but from the deep need of a fragile heart, longing for certainty. He took a fleece of wool and laid it upon the threshing floor. With eyes lifted toward heaven, he prayed, "Lord, if you will truly save Israel by my hand, let the fleece be wet with dew in the morning, while the ground around it remains dry." That night, silence covered the land. The stars hung heavy in the sky, as if listening to the quiet plea of a man unsure of his own strength. And when dawn broke, Gideon rose quickly. He went to the threshing floor, and there it was, the fleece, drenched and heavy with dew, while the earth around it was dry. He wrung out the fleece, and the water poured forth, a bowl full, clear and undeniable. Yet still, Gideon hesitated. His heart, bound by fear, longed for an even greater sign. With trembling lips, he prayed again, this time with humility. "Do not be angry with me, Lord, but let me ask just once more. Tonight, let the fleece remain dry, while the ground is wet with dew." And again, God answered with patience and mercy. The next morning, when Gideon approached, the ground was soaked with dew, glistening like silver beneath the rising sun. But the fleece lay dry, untouched by a single drop. In that moment, Gideon knew. The God of Israel was not only powerful but also patient with human weakness. His signs were clear, his promise unshakable. The timid man who doubted himself was slowly being transformed into the warrior God had chosen. The fleece on the threshing floor became more than a test. It was a symbol of God's faithfulness to guide even the most hesitant heart toward courage. Word spread quickly across the land. A timid farmer, once hiding in fear, had become the chosen leader of Israel. Gideon sent out messengers throughout the tribes, calling the people to war. The news stirred hearts. Men from every corner of the nation began to gather, eager to throw off the cruel yoke of the Midianites. Soon, a vast assembly of 32,000 stood before Gideon. Farmers, shepherds, and laborers, ordinary men who had known nothing but oppression, now came armed with hope and determination. To them, this was more than a battle. It was a chance to reclaim dignity, freedom, and their covenant with God. Yet among the crowd, fear was still present. Some whispered doubts. How can Gideon, a man from the weakest clan, lead us? Others questioned their own strength. They knew the Midianite army numbered in the hundreds of thousands, warriors well trained and equipped. Against such power, Israel's 32,000 looked like a fragile flame in the midst of a storm. But Gideon, though still uncertain himself, drew courage from God's promise. He looked upon the gathering of men and saw not weakness, but possibility. These were the sons of Israel, chosen by God, and their very presence was a sign of faith awakening once more in the land. The camp became alive with the sound of preparation. Spears were sharpened, shields repaired, and voices lifted in prayer. Fathers stood beside sons, brothers marched together, united by a single hope, that God himself would deliver them. Still, Gideon could not escape the weight of responsibility. 32,000 lives now looked to him for leadership, and he knew that victory could not come by numbers alone. He remembered the words spoken by the angel of the Lord, that God had chosen him, not because of his strength, but because the Lord would fight for Israel. And so, as night settled over the camp, Gideon gazed upon the sea of tents. The flicker of countless fires glowed against the darkness, a reminder that even in times of fear, God's light was not extinguished. The army had assembled, but the true test of faith was yet to come. When Gideon gathered the 32,000 men of Israel, it seemed a strong and promising force. The Midianites had oppressed Israel for years, and now the people were finally ready to rise up and fight. Yet God had a different perspective. He knew that if such a large army went into battle and won, the people would claim victory for themselves instead of giving glory to the Lord. And so, he began to reduce Gideon's army. The first instruction was simple: send home all who were afraid. Gideon announced the Lord's words, and 22,000 men departed immediately. Only 10,000 remained, and the army already seemed small compared to the vast Midianite host. Yet God was not finished. He told Gideon, "The people are still too many." The Lord then gave Gideon an unusual test. He was to take the men down to the water to drink. As Gideon watched, the men revealed their habits. Most knelt to drink deeply, but 300 scooped water into their hands and lapped it like dogs, staying alert as they refreshed themselves. God instructed Gideon to set apart those 300, for these would be his chosen warriors. The reduction was staggering. From 32,000, Israel was now left with only 300 men to face an enemy that could not even be counted, like locusts in number, with camels as numerous as the sand on the seashore. From a human point of view, this was certain defeat. But from God's point of view, it was the perfect setup to display his power. This moment tested Gideon's faith deeply. He had started as a timid man, threshing wheat in hiding, unsure of himself and uncertain of God's call. Now, he was placed in a situation where all human confidence had to be stripped away. The victory, if it came, would clearly be the Lord's doing. The story of the army's reduction reminds us of a timeless truth. God does not need great numbers or worldly strength to accomplish his purposes. He delights in using the small, the weak, and the unlikely, so that his power is made unmistakably clear. For Gideon and his men, the impossible odds were not a curse, but an opportunity for God to reveal his glory. That same night, God urged Gideon to go down to the enemy camp. Fearful but obedient, he crept through the shadows with his servant, Purah. As they reached the edge of the Midianite camp, Gideon saw for himself the vast sea of tents, so numerous they seemed like locusts covering the valley. Their camels were countless, like grains of sand on the seashore. In the stillness of the night, Gideon overheard two Midianite soldiers speaking. One soldier shared a troubling dream. "I dreamed a round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck a tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His comrade immediately replied, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." Hearing this, Gideon's heart surged with faith. What once seemed impossible now became certain. The Lord had already delivered Israel's enemies into their grasp. Gideon bowed in worship right there at the edge of the camp, overwhelmed by the assurance of God's promise. He hurried back to Israel's camp and proclaimed with boldness, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." The words carried weight, igniting hope and courage in the hearts of the 300 men. What began with doubt, fear, and constant requests for signs had now turned into unshakable confidence. God had not only given Gideon a miraculous sign, but had also made the enemy themselves testify to their coming defeat. This divine reassurance transformed Gideon from a hesitant man into a courageous leader, ready to step into the battle with full faith in God's victory. The stage was now set. 300 men against an innumerable army. Yet with God's word confirmed through the dream, victory was no longer in question. Under the cover of night, Gideon prepared his 300 men for a most unusual battle. There were no swords distributed, no shields raised, and no chariots rolling into position. Instead, each man was given 3 simple items: a trumpet, a torch, and a clay jar. To any human eye, it looked foolish. How could such tools defeat an army so vast that it was described as countless as locusts spread across the valley? Yet this was God's strategy, designed to show that victory would come not by human might, but by his power alone. Gideon divided his men into 3 companies, circling the enemy camp from different sides. He told them, "Watch me. Do as I do. When I blow my trumpet, you blow yours. When I break my jar, you break yours. When I lift my torch, you lift yours. Together we will shout, 'A sword for the Lord and for Gideon.'" The plan was as much about faith as it was about warfare. These men were not armed with weapons. They were armed with obedience and courage. At the appointed moment, Gideon lifted his trumpet to his lips. The piercing blast shattered the silence of the night. All around the valley, the 300 men echoed the sound, their trumpets blaring in unison. Then came the crashing of jars, the clay shattering into pieces, and suddenly 300 blazing torches lit up the darkness. From the enemy's perspective, it looked as though an enormous army had descended upon them. Confusion and terror swept through the Midianite camp. The Israelites raised their cry, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The valley echoed with the shout, the trumpets, and the blaze of fire. The Midianites, panicked and disoriented, turned on one another. In their confusion, they struck down their own comrades and fled in terror. What had begun as 300 faithful men with fragile jars and flickering torches became a mighty force in God's hands. The strategy was never about military strength, but about trust in God's wisdom. By this, the Lord demonstrated that even the weakest vessel, when surrendered to him, can shine brightly and bring victory. The night was silent, the kind of silence that weighs heavily on the air before something great is about to happen. In the valley below, the Midianite camp stretched endlessly, thousands upon thousands of tents, soldiers, and camels as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Their sheer numbers should have been enough to terrify any army. But Gideon did not have an army. He had only 300 men. 300 against an enemy that looked like a vast ocean of warriors. Yet Gideon had something far greater than numbers. He had the word of the Lord. With courage burning in his heart, he divided his small band into 3 groups, giving each man something unusual for battle. Not a sword or shield, but a trumpet, a clay jar, and a blazing torch hidden inside. Strange weapons for war, but they were exactly what God had chosen. Under the cover of darkness, the men crept into position surrounding the unsuspecting Midianite camp. They waited, every breath held, every ear tuned to Gideon's signal. The moment arrived. Suddenly, the night exploded with sound and light. The men smashed their jars, and the torches flared bright against the darkness. They raised their trumpets and blew with all their might, the piercing blasts echoing across the valley. And then, with voices thundering as one, they cried out, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" The Midianite camp was thrown into chaos. Woken from their sleep, the enemy soldiers stumbled out of their tents, confused and terrified. In the flickering torchlight and deafening noise, they saw enemies everywhere. Panic spread like wildfire. In their fear, they turned their swords on one another, striking down their own men as they fled in confusion. What should have been an impossible battle became a miraculous victory. Gideon and his 300 did not even need to lift their swords. The Lord himself fought for them. The power of obedience, faith, and God's mighty hand brought down an army too vast to count. What began as the night of certain defeat turned into the dawn of deliverance. Against all odds, the people of Israel saw with their own eyes the truth. Victory belongs not to the strong or the many, but to those who trust in the Lord. The silence of the night shattered with the thunder of 300 trumpets and the sudden crash of breaking jars. The blazing light of torches pierced the darkness as Gideon's men surrounded the Midianite camp. From every side came the unified cry, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" Panic swept through the enemy camp like wildfire. Startled from their sleep, the Midianite warriors stumbled out of their tents, unable to grasp what was happening. The sound of trumpets echoed through the hills, magnified by the night air, making the small Israelite force seem like an endless army. Fear gripped the hearts of the Midianites, and confusion clouded their senses. In their terror, they turned on one another. The chaos of the night made friend and foe indistinguishable. In the frenzy, swords were drawn and thrust wildly, striking down their own comrades. Shouts of alarm mixed with cries of pain as the once mighty army dissolved into madness. What had been a vast host moments before was now in complete disorder. Some fled blindly into the darkness, trampling their allies in desperation. Others fought shadows, convinced that Israel's army was upon them in countless numbers. Every trumpet blast and every torch held high deepened their dread, convincing them that defeat was inevitable. Gideon and his 300 men stood firm, watching the hand of the Lord bring victory without lifting a sword in combat. What no strength of man could achieve, God accomplished by turning fear into confusion and confusion into destruction. By dawn, the camp that had once threatened Israel with overwhelming power lay in ruins. The Midianites, broken and scattered, were fleeing in every direction. What began as an impossible battle was won through obedience, faith, and God's mighty hand. The people of Israel would remember that night. The night when 300 men, armed only with torches, trumpets, and faith, brought down an army beyond number. The victory was not yet complete. Though the Midianite camp had fallen into chaos, Gideon knew the enemy could still regroup if left unchecked. With only 300 men, he could not finish the task alone. So he quickly sent messengers throughout the hill country, calling upon the neighboring tribes of Ephraim, Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh to join in the pursuit. The call was urgent. The enemy was on the run, and now was the time to strike before they could escape across the Jordan River. The response was swift. Warriors from the surrounding tribes rallied, eager to join in the triumph the Lord had begun. They surged down toward the river crossings, cutting off the Midianites' escape routes. The once mighty oppressors, who had terrorized Israel for years, now found themselves hunted and broken. Their great army of countless camels and soldiers scattered in fear, driven by confusion and dread. In the midst of the pursuit, two princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, were caught. Oreb, whose name means raven, was captured at the very rock that would bear his name. Zeb, whose name means wolf, was seized and killed at a nearby wine press. What had once been symbols of power now became markers of their downfall. Their severed heads were brought to Gideon by the men of Ephraim, a grim testimony that God's deliverance was complete. This was more than a victory of swords and strategy. It was a declaration of divine justice. For 7 long years, the Midianites had plundered the land, leaving Israel impoverished and in despair. Now, in a single night, the tables had turned. Gideon's obedience, the faith of 300 men, and the hand of God had brought low a vast enemy that once seemed impossible to defeat. As the dust settled and the news spread across the tribes, the people of Israel could hardly believe what had taken place. The oppressors who once rode proudly through their fields were gone, and their leaders lay defeated. What began with a fearful farmer hiding in a winepress ended with the land echoing with shouts of triumph. The story of Gideon's pursuit was not just about chasing enemies, it was about chasing away fear, doubt, and oppression. It was a reminder that when God calls and his people respond, no enemy, no matter how vast, can stand against them. If this story inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that God can use even the smallest army to win the biggest battles. Want to hear more powerful Bible stories like Gideon's victory? Then make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss the next life-changing lesson from God's Word. And before you go, tell us in the comments, what part of Gideon's story stood out to you the most? The fleece, the dream, or the 300 warriors?